India has a $1 trillion infrastructure development plan. Well, that number itself seems to signify a huge opportunity for British infrastructure companies, but somehow that hasn't translated on the ground. What will it take to change the equation? I'm going to put that question to Arvind Mahajan, who's partner and head infrastructure and government services at KPMG India. I'm borrowing liberally from a report that KPMG has compiled, and therefore I put this simple question to you. The size of the opportunity, no contest on that. Yet, when it comes to British firms in the infrastructure space in India, a majority of them are just providing infrastructure services, not going beyond. You know, why? In a simple, brief manner.
So let me answer the question in two parts. There are certain things in the current environment which basically needs to change with reference to the infrastructure story, and there are certain things which need to change on the behalf of the UK firms and the government in how they address the opportunity. Let me start with the first one, because virtually the pendulum has shifted in the India infrastructure story from what 3 years back, when it was the next big thing, to today, when it's in a bit of a pause mode. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the story is over, because there's still a very large infrastructure deficit which is increasing. It's just that in the current environment, given the investment climate and given the fact that many of the major players in the infrastructure are very highly leveraged, what it means is that they first need to unravel certain aspects. On one hand, disinvest some businesses for the players. On the other hand, from the government's part, they need to relook at the policy and regulatory framework and tweak it to make it much more different compared to what it was earlier. Now, to my mind, these things are starting to happen, and they will probably happen over the next 6 months to a year. So to my mind, yes, this $1 trillion opportunity, while it was supposed to happen in the next 5 years, may take 6 years or 7 years, but the infrastructure deficit actually, because it takes time to develop infrastructure, is actually going to deteriorate before it starts improving, which means there's a big opportunity for whoever is willing to invest in that infrastructure story. Now,
and on the other side, you said, British firms in the UK in the infrastructure space and the government need to change their orientation. What did you mean when you said that?
So what I meant was that, so far, as you said from our report, is that basically the first wave of the investment which has happened has been largely, if you like, Indian private sector players, along with, in some sense, a private equity financing which has come from a global, including some UK-based PEs which are focused on infrastructure, like 3i, Actis, and others.
Yes.
However, the major players which are there from either on the EPC front or, for that matter, from a PPP, this thing really haven't taken a lead in investing in the sector. And if you've seen the last 3-4 years, we've seen many other countries take a lead in terms of following the Indian players in investing in the infrastructure story. One hand, it's been the Japanese companies and the Japanese government on the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, which has been tied with basically JICA financing, which enables certain the sort of alignment of interest between Japanese government, Japanese large conglomerates, as well as the financing agencies, to make sure that those projects go to the Japanese companies.
And there's no equivalent in that sort of partnership that was proposed by David Cameron for the Bangalore-Mumbai economic corridor? I mean, can we draw a parallel there, or is that too early stage?
In one sense, it's in a very early stage, and we need to see how that develops. But what I'm saying is that that's something in the right direction. But I think we need to see that while you have focused on the project, how do you get the alignment of interest? And usually UK companies are not so good in tying financing, government and this thing, government to government, along with other interests. So it's usually the companies left to fend for themselves. And in that sense, actually, as I said, the first wave of British firms have been largely the services firms, which are either in the design or, if you like, in areas such as engineering, services, as opposed to those which have been in EPC and in PPP. The other interesting story is really been in terms of the Chinese companies, which in the power sector have really virtually got most of the significant orders from a power equipment perspective by tying in actually basically renminbi based very low cost financing. So there are, and of course the French and the Spanish companies, while they don't have the same government backing necessarily always, though in the nuclear sector there has been fairly influential backing of the Prime Minister of France for the nuclear deal, whereas on the Spanish companies, of course, have experience of working in emerging markets in Latin America and have probably investing in a big way in the last few years. So relatively speaking, I think the British companies have been late in terms of
and you made a very important valid point, basically looking at aligning all the interests and creating that model for approaching the infrastructure space in India, like perhaps the Japanese have done.
Correct. So what I would say is that there are perhaps 3 or 4 things that which the UK government, companies, others could do, which could leverage on strengths of UK. So first of all, as I said, they probably, I do think that though late, the BMEC and looking at a large project which sort of focuses the government of India's effort as well as the UK government, along with getting excited the UK companies, that is potentially a large opportunity, it sort of helps to focus. And similar to that, probably they need to look at 1 or 2 large significant projects in the state governments, like like for example there's the Mumbai Trans Harbour Link project or the Navi Mumbai Airport project. These are huge projects, and if there was an interest on 1 or 2 states where they see some action happening, that's something. So focused attention on large projects, which could be one way of looking at it. The second is really in terms of the PPP model in India is undergoing a change, because the risk sharing model between private sector and government, the way it was being aligned, clearly in hindsight has not worked.
Yeah.
So, and given the fact that most of the players are highly leveraged, unless we tweak that model to make it much more availability based, linked to results, and not necessarily pushing certain risks like basically the revenue risks or toll based risks, which we've seen whether in the power sector where the coal prices risk was passed on, is really not happened. See, the residual risk in PPP is always with the government, and we've seen that in the financial crisis it went to the US government, and we've seen that in any of the other infrastructure projects. You can't transfer risk which is not transferable. So you have to make sure that the right balance is there in the way you structure the project. So, and to that extent, the way I see it, as the policy is changing, there's a lot of history of PPP. Originally, PFI was something which was developed in UK. Of course, it's evolved in Canada and many other countries. So leveraging some of that and working with the Planning Commission and DEA in terms of the model,
that could be very useful.
That could be useful, and that could also show something which is unique. And as the government is looking at investing in social infrastructure beyond the hard like education and healthcare, that's another area where the UK government has got a lot of experience. And as the government is working out PPP models for social sector, then another area where UK can take a lead in working on a few pilot projects with the government of India to sort of help develop some of this. So the second, as I said, would be the PPP approach. The third, I would say, is that as we go around this path, there's a huge skill deficit.
In India, and that's where the UK
and again, when on in areas such as vocational training, in the areas of technical development, there's a whole value associated with a lot of the education system, and we've been discussing that in this conference over the last day or so. So, leveraging some of that in the skill area will mean that you are creating an ecosystem which is holistic, not just focused on the companies, but on how skill is developed, and working with the Indian government in terms of the National Skill Mission or some of those in terms of addressing that big issue. So these are 3 things I would suggest we could look at from the UK part in India. But there are 2 things which we could do on the other side as well, which is basically, UK is a big financial center, and as we look at getting debt finance, we should, and we can look at maybe leveraging the, London as a financial capital.
But, isn't that already happening? The Indian government working on a London-listed feeder fund. The UK government is really collaborating with the Indian government and sort of designing it. Correct me if I've got any part of the description wrong. So, it is happening at a government-to-government level as well, and will increasingly happen in the private sector space as well.
So I agree with you that that's a good first step, and we've mentioned that as something which, and we need to build upon that. And really speaking, it's unlikely that Indian companies will go and invest in infrastructure in UK, because their interest is more aligned to emerging markets where more of the investments are going to happen. But where the opportunity is, as I said, to look at leveraging that capital market, and the feeder fund is a good example of where it's been done in the past, but we need to do more of. And the second is actually looking at, Africa is a frontier market, and whereas there is a lot of equity for UK in some markets, there's a lot of equity and diaspora of India there. And the two together, the Indian infrastructure players who have now built some capability along with UK players, could together look at partnering in Africa or other emerging markets, going forward. So I think that's something, and in one sense, actually, Balfour Beatty, which is one of the UK companies which have recently come in and looking now to look at either the, partnering with the Tata Group on India market, is, I'm told, also looking at maybe partnering for emerging market. I think that's something which
that's a story that can be grown. That's a story
which can really be grown, and that's an opportunity which has not been leveraged enough.
On that note, and it's an optimistic one, if I may say so, thank you very much for your insights and your time.
Thank you.